Welcome to Cruise Through HTX. My name is Freddy Cruz. This is a podcast for anybody who wants to learn the stories of the individuals, businesses, and organizations that make the greater Houston area great. And today I'm talking with somebody who has quite literally changed the way the pop culture world views the Space City. I'm talking about John Simons, the founder of Comic Palooza. During this conversation, we talk about his latest book, The Saga of Bjorn Unfrid, how he's been a storyteller even before he ever started writing books. We talk about how he got Comic Palooza from a movie theater in Katy to West Oaks Mall, all the way down to getting superstars from all over the world, the biggest stars that you know, big names, into the GRB. It's a fun conversation, and if you enjoy listening to it as much as I did putting it together for you, please consider sharing and subscribing to the show from my website, cruisethroughhtx.com.
Hi, I'm Ed Sheeran. This is Bruno Mars.
Hey, it's Katy Perry.
This is your man Flo Rida with Freddy Cruz.
This is AJ Mitchell with Freddy Cruz.
Freddy Cruz.
Freddy Cruz.
Tell you go pick Mr. 305 and you already know what it is.
My name is Freddy, and it's time to cruise through HTX. So the saga of Bjorn Unfrid takes place in 1989 on the campus of U of H. I imagine there is absolutely no personal experience tied into it whatsoever.
Yeah, sure, none at all. Actually, it's 85.
85.
I didn't plan a particular year when I started it, but there were some historical events that I threw in, and when I checked them, I'm like, oh, it has to be 85. So it's 85.
85.
And that is the year that I went to U of H.
Okay.
As a freshman.
You're right. And on the U of H website, you graduated in 89. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so 89. But I mean, like when you think about it, 4 years is a long, even in the 80s, young people, a lot can happen in 4 years back in the day.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it really can. And, you know, this story, it's about somebody who's completely leaving everything that he knows. And he's got to go to a new place that is completely different. And he's got to learn to adapt. It's just got fantasy elements in it as
right.
well. But so in a way, it really parallels a lot of the same kinds of things that I was going through. And it's not that I was trying to be autobiographical. I was actually being really lazy. So, you know, I had a character that I wanted to write the story for, and I wanted a certain feel to it. And the easiest thing was to put him in a place where I'd experienced that myself. And so it sort of accidentally ended up having certain autobiographical parallels. I, however, do not see ghosts and ancient spirits and things like that. So
right.
That's a big difference.
And you don't have a blonde beard. And
That's right. That's right.
Well, and that was one of the things when you look at the cover of the book, I was like, wait a minute. I thought he was a college kid. Oh, wait, never mind.
Yeah. Yeah, they can have beards. That's right.
Yeah. But I mean, the guy looks strikingly old. He looks like a Viking, like an older, like, I don't know, mid-30s, mid-40s, something-year-old Viking, not like a college kid.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you also have to remember, when you look at that cover, there's a little story behind the cover, too.
Oh, I want to hear it.
Okay, so I had this idea for a really slick, realistic cover with Bjorn and, you know, a couple of these spirits that he sees. And my artist, who is a known artist around Houston, he was at, I don't know, every Comic Palooza up through like 2017 or 2018, right? And he's known in the fandom here. And he said to me, well, you know, you've really tied this into Houston, and so why don't we tie your cover art style into Houston art?
Mm.
And Houston has this sort of relationship with graffiti art. You know,
you don't say.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you know, you drive into town and you've got that sign, be someone, and the city is really, really loves that. So if you look at the cover, it's not actually showing Bjorn or a crow. It's showing graffiti of them on a building.
Ah, okay.
So because you can kind of, if you look really close, and it's hard to do on an electronic device, but if you look really close, you can see it's painted on a brick wall. So So, it's not exact. It's really designed to be like a graffiti cover of the character.
When was the last time you went out with an artist and did some graffiti art?
Yeah, well, so me personally, if you saw my art, you would never ask me to participate in anything artistic.
I've seen some pretty terrible graffiti art, though.
Yeah. I mean, true. I'd rather not go the terrible graffiti art way.
There you go.
But yeah, so that's sort of where the cover came from.
This episode of Cruise Through HTX is brought to you by my media company, Speak Podcasting, on the web at spekepodcasting.com in our first online course of 2024. I'm excited. It's called PodQuest, Cracking the Code to Creating a Binge-Worthy Show. This is for two types of people, all right? One, aspiring podcasters who want to launch their show on the right foot. And two, unfocused podcasters who know they're unfocused and they want to relaunch with a clearer and more concise vision for who their ideal listener is. It's futuristic, it's interactive, we got some really cool video content for you, and it's using storytelling techniques. As you know, I've written 3 novels over the past 5 years, and so this right here was super fun for the team and I to create, and we can't wait for you, the future podcaster or current unfocused podcaster, to enroll and take the course. Check it out at speakpodcasting.com/podquest. What would you say would be your favorite part of taking a stroll down memory lane, like back to the 80s when you're writing this book?
So I got to do that a little bit because, again, I was being sort of lazy. I was at U of H, and I'm like, what are some of the things that I did? So Bjorn does some very U of H in the 80s college-y type things. He went in the middle of the night to House of Pies, and he plays Frisbee golf, and he does a few things like that. So those were some of the things that I remembered as an on-campus student. So if you were at U of H in that time period, you might recognize a few of those things. And he hung out on campus in some of the places that people might recognize, places that aren't there anymore, right? And that was another reason I had to put it in the 80s.
Yeah.
U of H campus is different. Right?
Way different.
Way different. So, this has references to the satellite and the quad. He lives in the quad, which was demolished a few years ago.
Yeah. And, my family and I, we were driving around I don't even know what we were doing on that part of town. My wife and I both went to and graduated from U of H. And we were driving around and the area where the big gravel dirt parking lot was next to Pizza Hut, it's no longer there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a dorm of some sort, or maybe some kind of building, fancy, newer building. Right. Not as much of an eyesore. That parking lot. Yeah.
Well, and I also mentioned like the A.D. Bruce Religion Center, which I believe is still there.
Okay.
Which is like probably the most beautiful place on campus.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a fond memory too.
Let's talk about something you mentioned in a previous interview, and that's that the world you lived in running a comic book store prior to Comic Palooza being sort of an incubator for life after Comic Palooza, where you're storytelling and creating all these fictional worlds.
Before I did Comic Palooza, I had a comic book store called Midnight Comics.
Right.
And I opened it in 1994 with a couple of partners, and I ended up buying out both the partners. And I sold it in 2010 because I was too. I mean, I had a lot going on. I was doing Comic Palooza, and I had a kid, and there was a lot. And but having a comic book store, we went through some ups and downs financially, and there was a period where nobody was coming in the evenings, right? I mean, why have a store open till midnight if nobody's coming in?
True.
And so what I did is I decided I was going to start demoing games on Thursday night, because Thursday night was the deadest night. It's Thursday. Who wants to do anything, right? And so I started demoing Dungeons & Dragons. And the thing about demo games in a game store is you usually demo what's going to get you the most money fastest, and that's card games. And I didn't do that. I demoed the role-playing games because that was what I was really good at and liked and knew. And it took a month to get the first group to have enough people to play it. And that was in September, I think, when I started doing it. And I demoed this game. Anybody could come in and sit in and play the game on Thursday night. And it was a pickup game. They could make characters and they'd keep them from week to week, but we could make new characters or have new people or whatever. And I had to be able to adjust the story on the fly. And so, somebody would come in, and I couldn't rely on a module. I couldn't have a big plot. I had to work with whatever was there right then. And so I would create NPCs as I needed them. They had to have personalities, backgrounds. I would sometimes develop the whole plot out of it because these characters, I don't know where they're going to go. These players, they'd come in and they'd do something unexpected, and I'd have to come up with an entirely new story in the space of 2 or 3 minutes. And I couldn't let them know that it was all being improvisational, right? So I ended up doing that for years. And when I got back to writing after I'd sold Comic Palooza, I'd always been a short story writer, right? And I got back to writing, and all of a sudden I'm writing novels. And I couldn't write anything short anymore because I was writing these characters and the characters were taking over. So all of this work that I was doing with my customers in Midnight Comics taught me how to write these stories that were all about the characters. And they demanded a lot more room, right? So that was how that happened.
And when you talk about NPCs, that's non-player characters. We're talking about people that are, for lack of a better term, inconsequential to the plot, not the main character. These are like when you're playing Grand Theft Auto and there's the random gangster that gets run over by the car or whatnot. But you're making these people interesting.
Well, yeah, and I went on to create like a standard campaign world that I used all the time. So there were places like whether you went and played in my game or you played in the Thursday game, there were always places you could go that you would know. There were people that you would see time after time. And it created an entire setting where they all had, motivations and they all had character quirks. Some of them I can't do anymore, but like the sheriff was essentially a John Wayne imitation that had his own quirks. But I mean, they weren't. I would take inspiration from other voices. Right?
Oh, sure, yeah.
But they all had their particular personalities, And so it was fun, and it changed the way I handled characters.
You were character building and universe building and workshopping. And you didn't even, I guess at that time, you didn't even realize it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I thought, man, I'm not writing anymore. Why can't I get back to writing? And then I'd go and I'd sit down for 4 hours and I'd do like plots and characters and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
And sometimes the players, they'd get stopped. They wouldn't know what to do. I'd have an NPC say something. They wouldn't say anything. I'd have another NPC. And I'd end up having a conversation with myself, And... But they loved it. It was very popular, right?
Yeah.
And so I figured, if I can build an audience for the games that I'm running, people are going to like these books.
Absolutely. Let's talk about Comic Palooza and like what got you wanting to start something like this, and did you have dreams and aspirations? I know we talked a little bit before we started the interview here about how you start something not realizing how big it's going to be, and it's a juggernaut.
So it's a little bit different. There's a side to this that I used to give people the origin story of Comic Palooza all the time, but it was quick, right? And so there was a part of it that most people never heard, and so Comic Palooza started. It was the same week that Batman: The Dark Knight came out, right? And it was a 6-hour signing in the lobby of the Alamo Drafthouse Theater on Mason Road in Katy. And from there, the next spring, it was in West Oaks Mall, and it had grown to a free 2-day comic book festival, right? And then the next year, it was in the George R. Brown, right? So it sounds like, rags to riches story, got so lucky, won the lottery. It wasn't like that at all. I had actually, I saw what was going to happen to the market. When I had this epiphany that Marvel Comics and the comic books in general were going to become much broader based, and that was when the Blade movie came out.
Okay.
Because everyone was going to see it, nobody even knew that it was a comic book movie. I'm like, comic books are going to hit it big.
I had no idea it was a comic book. I was today years old.
Yeah, and everybody was like that, right?
Yeah,
and I had this epiphany, but I didn't have anything to do with it. I was just running a comic book store.
Yeah. Well, you were just observing.
I was observing. Well, I was participating in the marketplace.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
I
yeah.
could see this. I could see this coming.
Yeah.
This was a few years ahead. This was years ahead, and I didn't have any idea what to do with it. And I wasn't really trying. But meanwhile, I had the store, and I was trying to offload all the, my extra inventory. And normally, when you have a comic book store, you do that at a comic convention. And I couldn't, because the comic conventions around here, they weren't very successful. They'd start off, they'd be small but good, and then they'd deteriorate. And I put a lot of thought into that, because it wasn't just one guy; it was all of them who were doing it. So I started looking at it. And I thought, none of these guys are doing it. I had theories about what you needed to do. And so I spent time researching. I spent about 2 years doing a business plan for a convention. And then I put the business plan together. I knew how much money I wanted to do for it, where I wanted to do it, all this stuff. And I didn't have the money for it, right? And there came a time when I decided I was going to do this little event. And I thought, if I'm ever going to do a convention, I need to start working with the media again, because I always promoted my store through media, not through advertising. So I decided I would do this little thing over at West Oaks Mall, and that was just a promotional event. And one of the reporters said to me, "What are you calling this?" I'm like, "Oh, I need a name for this, because they need to write about it." So I called it Comic Palooza. And so that was just a one-off promotional thing. That wasn't meant to be a convention. Then I got asked, somebody who had worked for me was working at West Oaks Mall, and they knew the promotional manager there, who was looking for things to do in the mall. And I'm like, well, I just did this. So I'm going to I recognize opportunity pretty quickly usually. Right?
Okay, yeah.
So I'm like, okay, I'm going to take this. I already did it. There's some name recognition. We'll do it again. Before we did it in West Oaks Mall, someone at the now I can't even think of the name of it, BHCVB, the convention bureau, called me. And this is because I had contacted them about getting cooperation for Comic Palooza the year before, but I hadn't heard back. They were looking for a pop culture event to take place in Houston, but none of the big national people wanted to come here, right? But they knew about me because I'd already contacted the Houston Film Commission. Oh. And they still had the letter. So they contacted me and they said, well, we wanted to get you in here. And I'm running this ridiculous little event in a mall for free using plastic skirting from Party City. And I'm like, okay, let's talk after. And they were very helpful in getting me into the GRB. So Comic Palooza, I had and the reason they worked with me was because I had a business plan. I'd spent 2 years working financials. It wasn't just these are ideas. It was I'd sat down with, I'd see a convention and I'd call the hotel, find out how much that space cost, and then I'd look at their layout, because everybody provides layout, and I'd look at their posted prices, and I worked out the financials as best I could. I'd looked at their attendance numbers, the public attendance numbers, and I estimated, what kinds of tickets they were selling, and I developed cash flows for, half a dozen different events. And I tried to figure out why. I didn't pull the trigger, though, until I'd had a conversation with my distributor. It was a different rep. I'd never talked to him before, and he let slip something. What he let slip was that Houston was the 14th largest market for direct comic sales. And the reason I was very hesitant about doing an event, even after doing 2 years of research, was that Houston had not proven to be very successful for all these little shows, and I had to figure out why.
So 14th in this context is it's bad, okay? Because you think about
Houston is the 4th largest city.
So so it's the market
So
is
it's
not
really low.
Right, it's too low for.
So my
gotcha.
So my thinking is, why is this? Is this because there are no comic book fans in the city? And I thought about it a while. That was my knee-jerk reaction. I'm like, no, that's not true. It's not true at all.
Yeah.
You go to a movie, a comic book movie, there's still butts and seats.
Right. Everyone loves Batman.
Exactly. Or Blade. Or,
right.
Whatever.
Yeah.
So that wasn't it at all, and I had to think about it, and it dawned on me that people are buying their comic books somewhere else. Instead of going to a comic book store, they might be going to, maybe at the time they were going to a B. Dalton or a Books A Million, not a B. Dalton, a Barnes & Noble or a, whatever.
Yeah.
And they're buying a graphic novel or they're buying it online or whatever.
Chain store or something. Right. Yeah.
So the way you promote a comic convention is typically, at the time it used to be putting flyers up in comic book stores. But if people aren't buying their comic books there, then that's not how you reach people.
Right.
So I didn't pull the trigger on Comic Palooza until I had a plan. And so what I went to was actually a strength of mine. I was always good with publicity, right? I mean, I did some crazy stuff.
I want to hear all about it.
I'll tell you one quick one.
Okay.
When Superman got married, right? You remember that in the late 90s?
Vaguely.
Okay, so I've got a comic book store. Superman's getting married. So I say, you know what? We're gonna do something with this. So I sent a press release to the newspaper, the Houston Chronicle, and I said we were going to throw a party. I almost said a wake, not a wake. He's getting married, right?
Right.
So we're doing a reception for Superman, right? You can come in costume. Please come in costume. We have cake and punch. And so we did this thing. It was front page. At the time, there was a section called This Weekend.
Okay.
And we were front page of This Weekend section for our part of town.
Oh, man.
And it was, a couple of us in these really bad superhero costumes. People loved it. So they showed up. They showed up to our store in droves on that weekend. It was packed. And everybody was in these crappy costumes. And we had a sheet cake and a bowl of punch. I mean, it was making bricks without straw. And it was fun. But those are the sorts of things that I would do to promote.
Love that. Scrappy.
Yeah, there you go. Guerrilla marketing. So my natural thinking was I had to do something else. And so I pivoted to, what I could do with the convention, which is bring in celebrities. So when we brought in celebrities, one of the stipulations we made in the contracts is they had to interview with someone.
Oh.
So we used to do that. We'd bring them in and we called the radio stations.
Yeah.
We had a few on the radio, but radio stations went away from doing online interviews, but there was still plenty on newspaper, TV, and that was how we promoted the event. And that bypassed comic book stores.
Huh.
And it got to the general populace. And that is why Comic Palooza was able to grow. My advertising budget was $2,000 a year.
Wow.
Yeah, that was it. And it was mainly for flyers.
Yeah.
It was nothing. So, there was a whole plan behind it. None of it was exactly accidental. It just didn't follow the path I expected, but I was using everything. I had worked very hard to build a plan and to understand the industry as well as I could.
So you weren't just jumping into it.
No.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I mean, I was in a way because I hadn't done it before.
Sure.
And there was no one to learn from here, you know. So I was in a way, but I wasn't without knowledge.
Right. Talk to me about going to Comic Palooza 6 years after you sell it off, and you're a panelist talking about your book.
Well, see, that was cool because as an organizer, I didn't go to panels. You know, I don't have an experience of going to conventions and to enjoy them as a consumer. I never do. I always go, I talk to people, I schmooze. It's like I'm always working on the next show, even if I'm not doing a show. And so I never went to panels. I went, I don't know, I've been to 3 panels myself out of all the times that I did it, and all the shows that I attended, you know, over the years, maybe 3 panels, 3 or 4, something like that. So I got to go to Comic Palooza and be a panelist, and that was awesome. I also got to go on Ming Chen's podcast, you know, and that was really neat. So that was a different experience. It was from a completely different perspective. But at the same time, I could see, I can look at what's going on, and I can see everything happening behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Because I've been on that side of it too. Mm-hmm. So it was pretty neat. And I actually have plans to be doing a lot more of that kind of stuff in the future.
Love it. What would you say would be your least and then your most favorite thing about being an independent author?
Wow. So I guess, you know, being in charge of the work creatively yourself has got to be the best. You know, I mean, even before I started writing again, I mean, I'd always heard stories about people who their stuff was significantly changed from their vision by their publishers. Mm-hmm. Right. And sometimes this can be good. You know, I mean, editing is good. Having other opinions is good. But sometimes they get forced into cookie cutters that they don't need to be to. The independent writing scene has a lot more originality than the traditional publishing scene right now. Like if you go and you're reading trad books all the time, you're kept in certain walled boundaries. And you get into the indie scene, and it is much more creative, right? That said, you know, you're also more responsible for your mistakes. Right?
Oh, yeah.
But then, you know, I think the worst thing about it is just promoting books. That is harder than promoting a comic convention, I will tell you.
Yeah, you can appear on 10 different podcasts and maybe sell 2 books from the exposure.
Exactly. I'm right there with you.
Yeah. Well, and the thing too, John, is that even with traditional publishing, and I've heard all the arguments of the pros, cons of each way, is that, well, you know, even if you get if you get a deal as a traditionally published author, they're not going to do the promoting for you. So
right.
Either way, you have to promote your book. And so
right.
What's the best alternative? Well, having complete creative control over what you're making.
That was why, I mean, like I'd always dreamed of being traditionally published. But then when I got back to writing, I'm like, there's no point anymore.
Yeah.
I've got to promote it myself, and I always knew that.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you another thing. You'll love this in particular. So I was in a writing group in the early 90s here in Houston, and this writing group had a speaker at the beginning of every meeting. It met twice a month.
Okay.
Right? And the speakers were usually writers, but they might also be agents or lawyers or somebody involved in the industry, right? But the writers often spoke about things like promoting their books. And I learned about promoting and publicity from the writing group.
Huh.
And then when I did Comic Palooza, I was using all the tricks that I learned about how to promote a book.
Yes.
That was all from the literary community, right? Then I'm like, I have done this a lot. I'm really good at promoting, you know, conventions. I know this. Then I went back to promoting my books today, and I found out that nothing works for books that used to work for books. So
Wild.
It's all completely new. Everything's completely new.
Always changing too.
It is. It is. So there are a lot of crazy things. And I'm trying experiments too.
Oh yeah, well that's how you. I feel as though that's how you grow as a creator, as a writer, or I'm not a musician, but even as a musician, you got to experiment because it's what keeps you fresh, keeps the wheels turning. And I mean, if you just keep doing what worked, if you keep doing what's worked for the past I don't know how many years, and you keep doing it for the next however many years, are you really growing?
Yeah, you're right.
Are you really? I mean,
Well, I tried this promotional experiment. When I came out with my first book was called Explorers of Rinth, and it came out last August. And it's a huge sci-fi book, right? And things I found out, people don't want to read sci-fi. People don't want to read huge books. So that's what I came out with, was a huge sci-fi book. So anyway, so my release, my launch event, I thought it would be really funny to take my characters who were in a sci-fi universe and send them to a science fiction convention. So I wrote some little really short pieces about that. And I was going to release them on social media. Now, you know, with a convention, you can follow what goes on at conventions on social media, right?
Right.
So I thought, you can't go to this convention because it's in this fictional world, but you can follow it on social media. So it has dates and times and everything. And then I'm like, I'm not going to do this all myself. So I started inviting other authors. Mm-hmm. So we did this event. It's called RinthCon, and we did it over 5 days last year. And authors were posting stuff about their characters at this fictitious convention.
Right.
And then when it was done, I collected it into an anthology. And I even had Jim Butcher in it. Jim Butcher's one of the biggest fantasy authors around, and he contributed a short story to it. So we did that, and I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. And then I wasn't sure if I was going to do it again. And then I was talking about it. I mentioned it in this author forum, and they're like, "Oh, that sounds like fun. I want to do that." So we're doing it again. So now I'm doing a convention that doesn't really exist.
The non-convention convention that doesn't. Yeah.
Something like that. So, but that's that's one of those kinds of experimental things. You try a lot of strange stuff when you're out in the indie market. Because you have that leeway and you never know what's going to work. Yes. Unless you try. Well, and this also, it is growing like an actual convention. Usually the first year of a convention is small and then it grows. Last year I had like 7 creators involved. I've got 21 or 22 this year. Wow. So I'm looking at a project that's actually getting kind of big. Maybe it'll get some attention. We'll see how it goes. Amazing. Before we wrap up, one more question. Yeah. Business advice you would give to anybody starting out, whether it's starting a comic book store, whether it's starting any kind of a bookstore, or why you would start a brick and mortar bookstore in 2024 is beyond me. But any kind of business, or if they want to start some sort of event, what would you tell them? Well, it's always going to be the same advice. First of all, study the market and build a business plan. And that's what you have to do. And if you don't do that, your chances of failure, if you don't have a plan, your chances of getting to your destination are 0 because you don't have a destination. Love it. Y'all check out the book on Amazon. It is the Saga of Bjorn Unfrid. The first book is Explorers of Rinth. He is an author. He's the founder of Comic Palooza. John Simons, you got to check him out. John, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show today. Thank you, Freddie. It was great.